Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm Matt. Thanks for stopping by. Now we've got a pretty interesting pattern for you today. Not so much that it has a really cool background and history. It's pretty similar to a couple other flies out there that are at least a couple hundred years old, but it does have two interesting materials. One of them is Lady Amherst pheasant tippets for the tail. I know a lot of you won't have that, and if you don't, just use golden pheasant tippets. It'll look a little bit different, but still fish the same. And the second thing, it's a dry fly with peacock herl body. Now that's not entirely rare, but you don't see it every day, so I still think it's pretty cool. But what I really want to talk about in this introduction, a lot of new tyers out there might not know, what is badger hackle? Well, it is just a feather from a chicken that has a black bar down the middle of it. You might see silver badger out there or golden badger. Silver is a feather that's just white with a black bar in the middle, and then golden is just pretty much a golden color. If you see a badger hackle that doesn't say silver or golden, it's probably just the typical standard brown. Now a good quality badger, cape or saddle, it's not that easy to find, and if you do find one, they're probably pretty expensive. So another thing I want to talk about today is what do you do if there's a fly you want to tie but you don't have good quality hackle for it? I mean, what did tyers do 50 or 100 years ago when something like this was not all that readily available? So this is a whiting half cape bronze grade. It's not a real expensive hackle, but it's a pretty good quality one. So this thing right here, going to have several sizes flies in here, but say I wanted to tie a size 12. I find the size 12 feather in here, and it's a pretty long feather. I can probably make 2 flies out of a feather this long. But that's because this is such a high quality hackle. And what that means is really the barb density is so high that that one feather right there, 3 wraps, maybe 4 wraps, is going to put down enough hackle to be a nice dry fly. And that's often why you can get several flies from one feather. But the good quality hackle we have today hasn't always been around. So what did they do 50 or 100 years ago when you didn't have all these high quality hackles? Well, they had hackles like this from an Indian rooster. That whiting hackle was bred for fly tyers. This thing was raised for food. So how do you use something like this to tie a decent dry fly? Well, it's kind of a challenge because none of these feathers on here are very long, and if I wanted to tie a size 12, I'm going to have to probably just get the tips, the last 1.5 or 2 inches from a few select feathers on here, and if I just use that, I'd only get about 3 or 4 wraps on it. That's not going to put down much hackle. So what you have to do, get 2 or 3 of these feathers and then wrap all of those. And I think, I wasn't around tying 50 years ago, but I think that's how they had to do it in the 1960s and earlier. So if any of you watching this were tying back in the 1960s, you've been tying for that long, I'd love to hear how you did it back then. Where did you get your hackle and how did you make your dry flies? And did you have to just use multiple feathers for each fly? So that's what I want to show you on this fly I'm about to tie. I had to use a couple of feathers on this to get enough hackle for it, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. But it's a pretty cool looking pattern, not hard to tie, and certainly if you have good dry fly hackle, it'd make it a lot easier. But I think you'll like it. Let's give it a shot. So there it is in the vise, a Badger Hackle Peacock. Pretty cool little old school dry fly. Not a whole lot to it. Now the recipe does say call for sizes as big as a 10 and as small as an 18. I'm going with a 10. I'm going to tie it on the bigger size. If I was tying a lot of these to fish, I would probably be going with 12s or 14s. But a 10 is a little bit easier to see in the camera. So go ahead and put some black thread down, lay a base to the start of the bend. And what I think is the coolest part of this fly is this tail, Lady Amherst pheasant tippets. Now I know everybody isn't going to have these, and if you don't, use golden pheasant tippets. They're going to look pretty cool as well. What I'll do, I'll just grab some by the tips, maybe 8 or so fibers, and then just snip it off. Haven't let go of the tips yet. Now they should be pretty well lined up, and they have stayed aligned. So I don't necessarily need that second black bar showing. Don't want the tail to be terribly long. So I'm going to just catch it in right there. I think that's going to be just fine. Now either snip or bury these excess right there. I'm going to just bury them because we do have a pretty long peacock herl, or pretty thick peacock herl body. which we are going to ribbit. Ribbit, that's what frogs say. Ribbit with small copper wire. Use extra small if you want. It's really just for durability. It's not going to add any flash. It's a dry fly, so we certainly don't want to add any weight anyway. Now after we got that caught in, let's catch in a couple strands of peacock herl. Got 2 strands right here. I've snipped off the first couple of inches of the brittle stuff. And just catch that in right there and then take it back to where I'm going to start wrapping them. Now you do have some options here. One thing you could do, you could pull several inches of your thread out and then just wrap this herl around it, build a little rope. You could spin this peacock herl as a rope. That might make it easier to wrap, but it's also going to make it, a little bit potentially more matted down. So what I'll do, and especially since I'm going to have a rib, I'll just put my thread halfway up the body and then just wrap this. But let's just take this all the way up. That thread right there will keep these herls from splitting up on me. Okay, couple wraps to tighten that off. Hold your thread tight, you can break those. Now that's the body I want. Pretty thin, but it's going to give you that nice little peacock herl look. So let's go ahead and counter wrap this rib, and you'll see in a second, it's not going to be that visible. 5 or 6 wraps is about all we need. This is pretty thin stuff, so 2 or 3 wraps, you can hold it tight and then helicopter it off. Now here's something I want to talk about. How do you make a dry fly with old cheap hackle? From this Badger Indian rooster saddle I have, if I wanted to just use one feather, I'd have to take the longest one I have, but I'd have to catch it in way up here, and that's going to put some, even if I get rid of that fluff, it's going to make some really long hackle, really long barbs there, which that's going to be tough to do. So what they did in the olden days, way before my time as a tyer, when you had to cheap hackle to work with, you're going to have to use more than one feather. So I'm just taking that from that same saddle and taking some of the smallest feathers and using the end, the 2 inches on the end or so, and I'm catching in 2, and sometimes you might even have to do 3. So I've got that caught in with a couple wraps right there, and my stem, I've trapped it up alongside the hook. And I'm going to wrap these one at a time. If you feel like you could wrap them both at the same time, yeah, go for it, but I find it's a little bit harder to do, so I'm going to wrap these one at a time. Even though I'm just using the smallest feathers I can from this, cheap Indian rooster saddle, I'm still putting down some pretty long barbs. And you can tell the feather density on this is not real high because I've put about 5 wraps so far. That might be my 6th wrap right there. And I have not put a whole lot of hackle down. So let's go ahead and catch this one off. And we'll do the same thing with this one right here. So this is exactly why old school tyers often had to use multiple feathers for a single dry fly. Okay, I think that's about as many as we can get out of this feather, so let's catch this one off. And there's a little bit of cleanup here. I've got several of these fibers going forward, so I'm just going to grab everything I can and put a few wraps right here. I'm not going to go way back. I don't want a big swept back wet fly look, but I want some room for my wet finish right there. Now this is where you have to be kind of quick because those fibers are going to want to spring back forward on you, and I'm going to try to zigzag this through here to get a good 4 turns without trapping any extra fibers going forward. And I think we did it. I'm going to slide one edge of my scissors up in here and then just kind of saw that thread off right there. Now let's take a look, see if we have any other cleanup. I think we're fine with that right there. We can put a drop of head cement on this and this will be a fishable fly. Just keep that in mind. That's one of the ways you can make dry flies out of lower quality hackle. We've probably got a good 10 or 11 wraps around the hook up there, and it's still not a heavily hackled fly. But overall, I think it's a fishable fly, and that's quite likely how they had to tie them, 100 years ago. So I appreciate y'all watching. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time.